is a bad guy in history who actually wasn't a bad guy. Richard Jewell, initially lauded as a hero and a brave man who ran towards the bomb to help. Then the FBI and media turned on him and accused him of doing the bombing himself. Because he was actually just as fucking outlandishly brave and ran toward the bomb to help people, they took his truck for evidence. He had to go into hiding. Made a villain by incompetent people. For years. Finally exonerated and dies shortly afterward. He was mocked for moving in his with mother. He and his mom did an interview on Oprah some time later. They said it was because his mom was sick and he was taking care of her. It's really not that uncommon for middle-aged people to move in with aging parents. BTW, his mom is still alive last I checked. She is still friends with his lawyer and their children. She is apparently a very nice woman. Oh man, my family still thinks I'm a failure 'cause I was my mom's caregiver for her final years. They never called, and never visited 'cause you seem to have things under control. After 5 years of emphysema, she took a turn for the worse and developed lung cancer, from which she passed a few months post-diagnosis. Then it was my fault 'cause I didn't catch it sooner. A year later and I no longer know my own purpose 'cause being a caretaker was who I was as a person, and they see me as a failure. Even though they didn't visit or call her on her deathbed. But it's my fault they didn't do that. That woman who was accused of kidnapping children because her kids didn't have her DNA, but in fact her uterus had different DNA than the rest of her body. Lydia Fairchild. She has chimerism, so her uterus has different DNA from the rest of her body, the DNA of her absorbed twin. William Thomas Green Morton died broke defending his discovery of anesthesia. He was a dentist and didn't get much respect from the doctors at the time. EMO, one of the most important medical discoveries. Anesthesia is arguably the most important medical discovery in history. Modern surgery is literally impossible without it. In Braveheart, William Wallace gets betrayed by Robert the Bruce, which never happened. He was loyal to the end. That movie made me so angry. I grew up on it, and loved it for what I assumed was a historically accurate portrayal. Not only is the movie absurdly inaccurate, the real history is arguably more interesting than the movie. There was no need for artistic restructuring. They could have just dramatized the actual events and it would have been a great movie. Of course the kilts and the blue paint are also ridiculous, but still something we can sort of forgive for artistic liberty. That film did Robert dirty, doubly so because he was actually a bigger hero of the people than William Wallace. In Sweden, a man was arrested for the murder of his wife, but she was actually killed by a moose. They thought he had used a lawnmower to kill her because of the damages on her body. It took a long time for them to write him off as a suspect and it ruined his life. Very few English articles about it, but his name is Ingemar Westland if anyone wants to try find something. Holy heck. How does a moose inflict damage that would make people think a fucking lawnmower did that? Edit. I know mooses, meese, are huge, but in my mind they can only inflict blunt force trauma, while lawnmower would leave cuts. Moose are really dangerous, large, territorial, and aggressive. I'm guess a combo of goring and trampling. There are signs up in the Adirondacks here in NY warning people to keep away from them, especially mothers with calves. It's kind of like the bison at Yellowstone and such. People think plant eater means peaceful creature who would love to take a selfie with me, and boom. There was an incident in China, I think, where a person was mauled by a panda because they climbed into the enclosure and tried to hug them. The zoo had to issue a statement reminding people that they are still bears. Well, think of it this way. 10,000 years ago these types of people would have been murdered by wild animals or something else preventable sometime within their short lives. Nowadays we still have stupid people, they just have less consequences for their actions. Bears, except polars, tend to be wary of humans. On the other hand, moose do not give AF at all. Also, like polar bears, the most dangerous thing about moose is that playing dead does not work on them. They'll keep stomping humans even after they've died, just for the fun of it. They're mean, and when I say mean, I mean they are bad, Jim. There isn't a moose alive who hasn't graduated magna cum laude from the Sauron Institute for the Criminally Vicious. Moose are quite possibly the most dangerous thing you see in the wild, and if you do see them, keep your distance. If you see a baby and you don't see its mother, do not wait to find out where she is. Just effing duck and bolt. Captain Bligh, his mistake was being too soft rather than too harsh. He let his crew slack off while they were waiting to make sure the breadfruit trees would survive transplantation, and they mutinied when he put them back to work. It should also be mentioned that when some of his crew mutinied, so many of them wanted to be allowed to leave with him on the ship's tiny open launch that even fully laden, they would not all be able to go and had to draw lots to see who had to stay on the Bounty. Captain Bligh then had to sail the tiny overcrowded poorly provisioned boat 6,700 kilometers to Timor using dead reckoning. He did not lose a single man. Absolute hero. It should be also mentioned that the mutineers were deeply evil people, who basically kidnapped Tahitian women as sex slaves. When another ship finally came in the vicinity of Pitcairn, it appeared that most of them had died either from drunkenly killing each other or from alcoholism itself. Bligh was an excellent sailor and probably rather lenient by the standards of his time, though still an officer punishing with lashes people who weren't necessarily volunteers, but at least he wasn't a drunken lout and sex predator like Fletcher Christian and his ilk. Hollywood, no surprise, loves to create absurd fiction. Bligh was an astonishing sailor and a man who refused to tolerate corruption. He should be regarded as a hero, as you say. He gained a reputation for not taking any bullshit from corrupt traders in the colonies, and risked his life by confronting officers who were basically using their military credentials to profit from trade. For the latter, he again faced a mutiny. There's plenty of evidence that, contrary to the behavior of rich fraudsters in the colonies, he was deeply admired by those who'd arrived in Australia without the power and influence of those who ran the place like a private members' club. At some point, a decent film needs to be made about the guy, because the public perception of him is complete crap. The McDonald's coffee lady. The woman who sued McDonald's after she spilled coffee on her lap received third-degree burns in her pelvic area. She was hospitalized for 8 days and required a couple years of rehabilitation. The media jumped on the story, making it a poster case for frivolous lawsuits. Yeah, the media made it seem frivolous on all ends. But the coffee really was way too hot. And the lady just wanted her medical bills paid. McDonald's previously did pay claims like this, but got tired of them and wanted the court to settle it. In the end, McDonald's made the company hired to train the staff to pay for it as they trained the employees wrong. But the media loved making the woman look advantageous and McDonald's a victim. Julius Caesar. He was no angel, but he wasn't executed for trying to turn Rome into a dictatorship. In fact, it was actually because he was a political reformer who wanted to tax the wealthy landowners. The Senate had always been very violent to reformers, as most of it was made up of wealthy landowners. They tried to rewrite history to make reformers like Tiberius seem evil for trying to grant rights to workers and small landowners, while death squad leaders who killed anyone advocating reform such as Lucius Sulla have been paraded by historians. Murdoch, on the Titanic. Dude went down saving lives. Cameron needlessly made him corrupt. Then, apologized, by paying $5,000 to the guy's village or something. Sorry, the guy that Winselt's fiancée tried to bribe to make room for him on the boat. Yay, he was nothing like that. One to pocket money, that is. He stayed till the end. Swell fellow. Same for Ismay. He was slandered by the press with lots of myths of him dressing as a woman to board a boat. The story that is more likely and supported by a lot of eyewitness accounts is that Ismay stayed on the Titanic a long time assisting to load boats. He ended up boarding the lifeboat because there was no one left to board. The only witnesses say this. For whatever reason during the sinking, the one side of the ship he was on wasn't nearly as crowded. It's said that he waited until no more passengers were present as well as waited for no one else to be there to board, then he boarded. Also, the hard evidence is there. He was in collapsible lifeboat C, which means he did wait. The boat was mostly filled with third-class passengers. So he also waited until first and second class were boarded. I think the Murdoch and Ismay myths are connected because they occur at the same side of the ship. The press basically ran with the idea that side of the ship had less people per boat because of class codes or something, when in reality it was because that side was the sloped downside, so less people went there. The whole scene Cameron added with him demanding they go faster was based on almost certainly false testimony from a civil case. Letters Ismay wrote other times showed he typically advocated for going more slowly when that was safer. Getting in earlier also made little sense. It would have been a logistical problem if they arrived early, with some passengers likely wanting off immediately while others may worry they will be forced off early when the onward transport they had set up wasn't available. The British inquiry into the Titanic disaster is loaded with false testimony. The IMM, owners of the White Star Line, put tremendous pressure on the crew and survivors of the disaster, even going so far as to threaten the crew with blacklisting and both heavy lawsuits. Many of those who testified as non-crew survivors were women, and the investigators worked damn hard to discredit their testimony and bully them into silence or changing the facts. There was a reason the American inquiry was so rushed. The government knew as soon as they got on board a British ship they were untouchable. The minute they were done testifying, the crew and Ismay were loaded on ships that were rumored that often departed immediately. I absolutely believe that the only reason that the British Board of Trade was held accountable for the lifeboats, and loosely at that, and the IMM was forced to change how the ships were built, was because of the sheer scale of the tragedy. Had it not been an international disaster, nothing would have been done. As for the getting in early thing, that was based off the rivalry with the Cunard Line, most notably the Mauretania, the then current holder of the Blue Riband, the award given for fastest transatlantic crossing. Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli didn't invent the idea of lying or ruthlessness. He made an observation about what worked and tried to get a new gig. Agreed. People often reduce his message down to, you should be opportunistic and manipulative, which wasn't what he was saying at all. It was more that he recognized that the worst atrocities in society typically occur during or shortly after huge political upheaval, and believed that if preventing that sometimes requires being opportunistic and manipulative, then that is a price worth paying. And whilst we all have lines that we think a regime shouldn't cross, and limits to what power a state should be allowed to exercise, he did have bit of a point. If we think of the worst atrocities across history, they do tend to follow political upheaval. Had the Treaty of Versailles not sought to punish a generation of Germans, Hitler may never have risen to power in the first place. Ironically, some of the people who were great admirers of Machiavelli's philosophy, like Joseph Stalin, were responsible for the very kind of terrible things Machiavelli was warning people about. This is the correct answer about Machiavelli. He isn't a satirist, and his work doesn't say, be evil. It is a work of pragmatism based on his own life experiences. Much of it says that you should try to be as peaceful and diplomatic as possible, but when necessary, a word Machiavelli uses very carefully to mean absolute necessity, you should do what you have to prevent slaughter. There's a reason so much of the discourses is dedicated to sections on why you shouldn't trust mercenaries. He saw how mercenaries abandoned their posts when things went poorly in the defense of small Italian towns, and how staunchly people would defend land they saw as their homes. He was essentially advocating for the idea of modern state-run militaries rather than private paid defense groups. Thinking Machiavelli is advocating for evil or opportunism have only read the sparknotes of The Prince, while the actual serious work he clearly intended to be all his thoughts on matters of state is the Discourses. He was describing how political power is attained and maintained according to how he saw it, not how things should be. Pharaoh Cleopatra, she was actually a pretty good ruler with her focusing more on her nation than just abusing her position for her own benefit. There's even some records saying that she wasn't even all that beautiful. She was however very intelligent with stuff like how she learned around 10 different languages. First member of the Ptolemaic dynasty to bother learning Egyptian. She did amazing things in managing to actually expand Egypt's territory in a time of Roman dominance. However, in the end she monumentally screwed up, lost her nerve at the Battle of Actium and doomed pharaonic Egypt. Nander the Relentless. How best to describe Nander? I would say he's blessedly unburdened with the complications of a university education, but give him an axe and he's second to none. Though you wouldn't want him as your barrister. It was only a little pillaging. Everybody did that. Tom the cat. Jerry is a menace. There was a post the other day talking about them and how they are actually working together. As long as Jerry keeps running around, the humans think they have a mouse problem, so they keep the cat. As long as Tom keeps showing he's making an effort, they think he's doing a good job. But they are both in on it and just do it to keep up appearances. There's apparently an episode where they work together to get food from the fridge, then hide and share it as friends before going back out and chasing each other again. Jesus was given vinegar to drink by the Roman. It turns out that the Roman military provided their troops with a water-vinegar mixture to drink because it helped them replenish their salt levels after perspiring. So, the only thing the Roman did was to offer Jesus a sip of his own drink rather than making him drink vinegar as punishment or a dig. I tried the vinegar, water drink of the Roman legionnaires, and the one that was flavored with local herbs from Syria Palestina is actually quite tasty and refreshing. I'm willing to bet that Jesus actually enjoyed his last drink. Calling Arbuckle the Silent Era's John Belushi, John Candy, Chris Farley doesn't even do him justice, but I can't think of anything better. Brilliant physical comedian and director, and by all accounts, an absolutely stellar human being who'd give you the shirt off his back without hesitation. He was one of, if not the biggest star at the time, then his career and personal life were totally destroyed overnight by scandal. He was tried 3 times, first 2 were hung juries. Final jury acquitted him, and even wrote Arbuckle a letter of apology for how he was treated by the justice system. Didn't matter, the damage was done. He was a mentor for Chaplin, and gave Buster Keaton his big break. It's hard to overstate just how important and talented he was, and what a loss it was to comedy and film when he was demonized and blacklisted after the scandal. His films were even banned under the Hays Code, despite his acquittal. Died way too young in his 40s, basically still a total outcast despite some later movie deals, and it's awful that the scandal is still all most people know about him. If you've never checked out any of his stuff, it's all fantastic, but The Butcher Boy was one of his biggest hits and was the first film appearance of Buster Keaton. A lot of Tudor women come to mind: Catherine Howard, Mary Tudor and Anne Boleyn. Catherine was sexually abused her entire life only for Thomas Culpeper to use it to blackmail and assault her. Almost every man in her life abused or used her, and she died a teenage girl. After her death, people made up bullshit about her wanting to be married to a rapist and blackmailer. She was a child. Mary Tudor was horrifically abused by her own father, torn from her mother and prevented from seeing her, even as she was dying, and went on to be demonized way more heavily than her father, who was a tyrant. Mary tried her best with what she had. After her father divorced her mother, she lived with the constant threat of assassination or execution. Her own father was willing to kill her. Anne Boleyn was not a seductress who tried to steal the king. She did not want the king and initially flirted with him to get back at a guy who courted and ditched her. She only agreed to marry Henry because she had to. Even before he met Anne, he was looking for a way to end his marriage to Catalina, Catherine de Aragon. Why? Because the only reason they were married was to preserve an alliance with Spain, and that fell through and she didn't have a son. None of which was Catalina's fault. Nor was Anne's. Anne Boleyn never wore yellow during the time of mourning for Catalina. Anne didn't abuse Mary. Henry did. The only reason why Catherine survived her marriage was because her nephew was the ruler of Spain, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire. It's also why his other wives came from much, much weaker families. And part of the reason she was picked is she had Plantagenet ancestry as well. People overlook how new the Tudor dynasty was, and Henry VII wanted someone who could shore up his son's claim to the throne. Catherine Howard and Lady Jane Grey were little girls slaughtered by the aristocracy out of flimsy principle. As my father-in-law once said, the first affair is hardest. After that it all gets easier. The nobles knew. Once Anne was in, the next plan was, who can we get in there from our family? Weak, despicable scoundrel Henry. Hades, he barely cheated on his wife and was loyal. He only kidnapped Persephone because Zeus told him to. He's a good father. He doesn't cause death, only what happens after. Also, he named his dog Spot, adorable. People always act like he's evil and malicious. But in all reality, he's a sweet guy. He barely cheated on his wife. In terms of Greek gods, that's the best we can get. What is barely cheated, anyway? As far as I'm aware, Hades has 3 kids, not counting the Furies, which are questionably either his kids or the children of Uranus, 2 from Persephone and 1 from an unnamed mother. Well, half the pantheon are Zeus' offspring, making most of the major gods his bastards. Hades only having a couple of kids on the side is comparatively chaste. In some myths the relationship is adultery, and in some it occurred before he met Persephone. That's the thing about oral traditions. They can be very different between city-states. Thanatos is the god of death. Hades, once he was created, was literally just a B&B manager who kept the souls where they should be. Hades doesn't kill you, he just does the paperwork. As far as I'm aware, Hades is never really the antagonist of any Greek myths. In fact, he often sympathized with heroes who impressed him, for example, giving Orpheus the chance to save Eurydice. Exactly. It's why Hades is such a brilliant game. He is an extremely powerful god, but his actual duties were being a bureaucrat. The only real villains in most myths are Hera and Zeus. One for being horny, the other for thinking other things are making her husband horny.